Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Mustafa Hiraj. I currently serve as the president of the LSESU Pakistan Development Society, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to the LSE Future of Pakistan Conference 2022. Before we begin, I would just like to ask everyone to join me for a moment of silence for the shuhada of the very tragic Peshawar mosque attack that took place earlier today. So the Pakistan Development Society was formed to provide a space for expression to overseas Pakistani students studying abroad in the UK. The connection that one has with his or her country can never be expressed with words, but the urge to do something for it can be fulfilled by action. We here at the Pakistan Development Society are incredibly lucky to have the opportunity to study in a country abroad. The Pakistan Development Society at LSE has organized 4 editions of the Future of Pakistan Conference in the past, where numerous personalities have been invited to give their thoughts on crucial topics related to our country. Our conference is a rare opportunity for Pakistani students based abroad to interact with important officials and deliberate about what the future holds for us. For the first session at the LSE Future of Pakistan Conference 2022, we are joined by Mrs. Yasmin Qureshi, MP from Bolton South East, who will be speaking about Pakistan-UK relations, the way forward. Mrs. Qureshi joined the Labour Party at the young age of 16 and was elected MP in 2010. She has sat on multiple crucial select committees, including those on foreign affairs, home affairs, as well as justice. Mrs. Qureshi's re-election in 2015 and 2017 gave her the platform to serve as the Shadow Minister for Justice from 2016 to 2020, and then as the Shadow Minister for International Development from 2020 to 2021. Her influence as a member of the House of Commons has been far-reaching, as made evident on numerous occasions, including her monumental efforts in getting Pakistan removed from the UK's travel ban list in September 2021. The moderator for this discussion will be Hafsa Ahmad, who is a graduate student at the LSE from Lahore, Pakistan. She is pursuing her master's in international social and public policy. Prior to this, she spent 5 years in the UAE at New York University in Abu Dhabi, completing her bachelor's in social research and public policy and conducting research around disability rights as a postgraduate research fellow. Her academic and research interests lie at the intersection of social policy, public health, and human development, with a particular focus on South Asia. Now, before I give it off to Hafsa to start the discussion, I would just like you to be aware of the following. You are not allowed to take any photos or videos during the talk. You are expected to maintain discipline and order while the speaker is speaking. After the moderated discussion comes to an end, the floor will be open for question and answer session. If you have any questions, please raise your hand and someone from the host team will come to you with a microphone. Your questions must be appropriate and precise, and the speaker reserves the right to not answer them if they deem them unfit. As for photography, our photographer will be taking pictures of the audience, but if anyone has objection to that, you can let us know after the event, and we will make sure to blur you in any of the photos that go up on our social media. With that, over to you, Hafsa.
Thank you so much, Mustafa. Can everybody hear me? I'm not sure if this is...
Yeah.
Thank you. My sincere thanks to the Pakistan Development Society, first and foremost, for putting this forum together and for their 2022 edition of the Future of Pakistan Conference. Yasmin, thank you so much for joining us here today. Before we get started, I do want to say that we want to make this session as interactive as possible. So do make notes, anything that piques your interest, make a question on that, and we'll have plenty of time to have an open conversation around those curiosities. Before I pose any questions, Yasmin, why don't you take this opportunity to tell us a little bit about yourself, the work that you do, and sort of your initial thoughts on what a bilateral relation between Pakistan and the UK has looked like and can look like in the future. And then we can jump right into it.
Right, okay. So can everybody hear me? Yeah? The mic is obviously working on this side. Right, firstly, Assalamu alaikum and good evening, good afternoon. depending on how you're all feeling at this time. I know it's a Friday, late afternoon, but I'm going to talk a few minutes about myself, and then I'm hoping that you will ask me questions, and I hope that you will ask me some challenging questions as well. And don't feel or hesitate about, whatever question that you want to ask, what you're concerned about, what you want to know about, or what you want my opinion about. So very briefly about myself, I was born in Pakistan in a town called Gujarat, which some of you from Pakistan will know is on the GT road between Islamabad and Lahore. I came to England when I was 9 years of age with my parents. A very typical migration story of people who come to the UK from Pakistan or the subcontinent. I was brought up in Watford. I studied in London. I qualified as a barrister in London, and I practiced here for many years. I then went off to work for the United Nations Mission in Kosovo, where I was helping to set up the judicial system. And then I came back and I got involved in politics properly. I mean, I had been a member of the Labour Party since I was age 16. And I was a governor of a school, a college of further education. I was doing a lot of voluntary legal work, as well as working within the Labour Party in terms of knocking on doors, doing leaflets, helping with campaigns. But I only came into frontline politics in 2005 when I stood as the candidate in Brenties, which is in North West London, as the candidate to general election. But I wasn't successful. Thereafter, I went to and became the parliamentary candidate for Bolton South East. Bolton is near Manchester, and that was in 2007. Now, the system we have here, and I just want to touch on this because if you're interested in politics, is unlike, say, Pakistan, and I don't know how the Indian or the other countries operate, but certainly I know in Pakistan, candidates are chosen by the national executive committees or the executive committees of the political parties. Well, here it doesn't happen like that. You may have that happening only in a by-election, i.e. if a member of parliament dies and they have to select a candidate very quickly, then the national party gets involved in who gets to be the candidate. But normally our system is that you apply to the constituency you want to represent, and it's the card-carrying members of the party who live in that constituency will actually make the decision as to who their candidate will be. That is the person who will stand at the election for them. And in Bolton South East, there was 51 of us who applied. There were 250 members of the constituency, and it was convincing all of them. And there's a lot of process that you get, about 12 weeks process. By the end of it, I was the one who was successful, and I became their candidate. And then in the general election of 2010, I stood, and obviously I won. It is fair to say that my constituency, since its inception, has always returned a Labour MP. So I'm very fortunate in that respect, and Allah's blessing that I've got, what looks on the face, on the paper, a very good, solid Labour constituency. But that doesn't mean to say one, takes that for granted. I still work at it like as if it's a marginal constituency. And I don't ignore my constituents. I try to work hard in Parliament to make sure that my constituents have confidence in me to be able to do things. Now, we will come on some of the issues that I've dealt with, which are of international relations nature, such as the Red List and others. But I think it's just important to emphasize that most of the time my work is what I call bread and butter stuff, which is dealing with issues of my constituents. That's people who live in my constituency, whether it's in education, health, immigration, local hospital, potholes on the streets, whatever. I, as an MP, are expected to get involved in that, and I do, and then speak and debate in Parliament on issues like poverty, disability, and so forth. But part of the job of a Member of Parliament is, leaving domestic issues alone, is international issues. Now, I get sometimes criticised on social media by some people, and often it's the very right-wing people, who say to me, why do you talk about, for example, if I talk about Palestine or Kashmir or Pakistan, they say, why do you talk about this? You're the MP for Bolton South East, not the MP for Pakistan or Kashmir or whatever. But of course, that is them being deliberately politically obtuse and just trying to be offensive. Because the truth of the matter is, United Kingdom, USA, Russia, every country in the world has more or less an army of some sort. Some have very big ones, some have smaller. So, and most will have missions across the world, big or small, depending on how big or rich the country is. Why do you do that? Why do we spend billions of pounds as a UK on our armed forces and on our foreign affairs? Because what happens in the international community, what happens in the world is important to people in the home ground as well. So I, as a constituency, I'm in Bolton South East, have got just as much concern about what's happening in the international level. And I think the last week and a half has just shown how important this is from not just from armament point of view, from diplomacy point of view, but also from the economics point of view, with the sanctions kicking in, coming in, being applied. And of course, these sanctions will hit Russia, but it will hit other countries as well, when they're not able to trade with them as well. So for me, international relationships and having good international relationships with the world is very paramount to not only to stability of your country, but also its economic stability, as well as diplomatically as well. So if we come back to the country in question here, Pakistan. Well, obviously, because I was born in Pakistan, and my family, some of them, most of them still live in Pakistan, I have a natural gravitation towards it, and I'm not going to run away from that. But obviously, I'm a British Member of Parliament as well, and so my first priority obviously has to be with Britain and its well-being. But at the same time, Pakistan is paramount for me as well. So when I had the opportunity to become the chair of the All Parties Parliamentary Group in Pakistan, I accepted that, and I had already spoken, if you look at sort of past history of me, I've spoken on issues like Kashmir, Palestine, Yemen, Islamophobia, hijab, racism, you name it, I've been dealing with those issues and I'm unafraid to tackle those issues. But when I became the chair of the Pakistan APPG, the All Party Parliamentary Group, and what APPGs are, and we in Parliament have many of these, essentially you get members of Parliament across the political divide. So the APPG is not just Labour MPs or Conservative MPs, it has SNPs, Liberal Democrats and others. And in fact, my co-chair, Ahmad, is a Conservative member of Parliament for Gillingham. When the issue, and I'll touch on the red list because I think that was it's an interesting case study actually about how to do international relations and how to do diplomacy, because India, and also how to think outside the box. And I'm hoping, I know that all of you are very bright, young, creative thinkers, and I'm sure when you come and deal with solutions, you will always think outside the box solution as well, because sometimes they can be the best way forward. Now, Pakistan is a country, as I said, I know quite a lot about, not perhaps 100%. I've traveled to different parts of Pakistan. I go there fairly regularly. I know some understanding of the politics of Pakistan, but I'm not an expert. I'm sure all of you here probably have far more better knowledge of politics of Pakistan or state affairs. But I can just give you like a bird's eye view, and I suppose I can try to give you the sort of the British perspective and how it's seen. Britain, when I've spoken to British diplomats, and you speak to our ambassadors, high commissioners in Pakistan, from what I've been able to sense from all of them, that they all seem to be really happy that they've been to Pakistan and there are high commissioners there. They seem to like actually living in Pakistan, and they say that Pakistani people are incredibly warm and kind, and they are having, they enjoy their time in Pakistan. I'm not sure they necessarily will say that of some other countries where, I'm not going to mention it when you meet the diplomats, but they certainly, and when you talk to the Foreign Office here, everybody talks about the importance of the relationship between Pakistan and the United Kingdom. And I think, and it is I think there's a genuine fondness in the British Foreign Office and in the British government, irrespective of which party it is, for affection and friendship with Pakistan. And I know people in Pakistan have very warm affection, a lot of them towards England as well. There is the old historical ties of the last few centuries. And I think those ties are still strong. people from, a lot of people in the United Kingdom, certainly in administrations, in government bodies, and in the diplomatic world, feel very good toward Pakistan, and therefore, and over the last number of years, we have tried to work hard to make sure that that happens. Because the one thing that does happen is that Pakistan does get, in my opinion, unfair, adverse publicity in the media here and across the world, and it's unfair and it's wrong. But then, most Muslim countries get unfair coverage in the media in this country, in the Western media. They don't get a proper, impartial, unbiased coverage. They don't actually tell what's really happening in most of these countries. Yes, every country has a problem, but they only talk about the problems. They never talk about the good things that are happening in those countries, the really great positive stories and things. So one of the jobs I suppose I see as a chair of the Pakistan APPG is to correct that narrative. And so over the number of years, I have spoken in Parliament many times where I have said that sometimes when people try to criticize Pakistan, I say, look, the war on terror, your war on terror, has been fought by Pakistan mostly, next door. And the blowback of it has actually been felt in Pakistan the most, with a record number of bombing, suicide bombing, and all the stuff that's been happening in Pakistan. That blowback is in Pakistan. And Pakistan, the economy has suffered, Pakistan's trade has suffered, people have died, and because of all this, other people don't want to come and necessarily invest in Pakistan because they think they may be unsafe. And yet you still sometimes turn around and say Pakistan should do more. And I said that's just not fair. The sacrifices Pakistan has made have been more than any other country in the fight about terror. And it's good that we're sitting thousands of miles here and USA sitting even further away. But the people who have to deal with the fallout of Afghanistan and everything is the countries in the region. So, and people do listen to that, but it's a constant argument that you have to make. I can say that I will continue to make that. I don't know, I think at this point I'm going to stop because I think that's just like a way, because I know you're organised, very, very efficient. They did a scoping paper and they've kind of, looked at some questions they want me to address or deal with. But I think that I've touched on a couple of things they wanted me to raise, but I think the rest I will leave it to the moderator to Hafsa to ask, and then I hope that you will also ask many questions instead of my just talking and talking and talking. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Yasmin, for that overview. I think you touched upon a couple of things that I would love to unpack, and then after a couple of minutes, we'll open it up to the audience. So get your questions ready, everybody. But let's unpack a little sort of your work at the APPG. It's obviously a body that holds a lot of power in terms of advocacy. And so I'm curious to know sort of in what ways do you as a group work together to influence bilateral ties and the agenda and the UK-Pakistan sort of bilateral agenda. On a day-to-day, what does that look like, and what influencing power does that hold in terms of the overall decisions that end up being made, be it on a trade front, security front, what have you?
Well, the APPG is really to try to put a narrative for Pakistan, but it's also to build a relationship with the United Kingdom. So it's not a one-way process, it's to ensure that UK and Great Britain have a good relationship. And sometimes these things turn up with what's happening. So for example, the classic involvement the APPG had in the last few years has been on the red list of getting Pakistan off the red list, which we felt was unfairly imposed, and that it was, when other countries were taken off the red list, and why was that the case? And that meant essentially involving our ministers, civil servants in the United Kingdom, and getting ministers and civil servants in Pakistan to work together as well. And that was important because we, the APPG, were able to bring these parties together. We were able to also tell to each other what's going on. So, for example, in the red list scenario, Pakistan government were putting up all this relevant statistics that they needed to do, upload in the worldometer or something about the pandemic's rate. There was an assumption being made in the Pakistan side that the British, when they're looking at this, will look at these statistics, facts and figures, and not put Pakistan in the red list. But the British were essentially expecting the countries that needed to come off the red list or not go into a red list or amber list or wherever should have been doing some of the pushing and off it and follow up of the information they'd provided. But when I found what was happening, I ascertained that Pakistan had even given the information to our High Commissioner, and he had faithfully given the information to the Foreign Office here and the ministers. But as you know, government departments are massive. Things get to the bottom of the pile, and unless somebody pushes and pushes, things will then come to the forefront. And in this essence, what happened is, and I have to say, I got involved in, had a lot of discussions with two really eminent people from Pakistan who I think were incredibly good. One was Asad Umar, the planning minister, and Dr. Faisal Sultan, who was heading the public health issues on this. From my discussion with them, I found out information I needed about, especially the scientific stuff. So I drafted some letters, which I got a number of members of parliament to sign. So it went in as a letter from many, many MPs to the ministry, where then they stood up and listened as well. They said, well, we need this information. So I go back to them and said, they want this information. Eventually, we managed to get the Pakistani scientists, the British scientists, the diplomats, sit together on a Zoom meeting and actually iron out what the concerns and issues were from each side and reassure each other, and then it eventually led to the red list coming out. And the reason I say thinking out of the box is because, to be honest, I didn't know in Pakistan who was in charge of what. So I had to ask around, and I was told that these are the people involved in it. So I then directly contacted them. I then directed our minister, and then I contacted our High Commissioner in Pakistan. I contacted the Pakistani High Commissioner here in the UK, and we got everybody together, and eventually, we were able to resolve it. And the difference was, and this was the difference, and it's not a criticism. I mean, pandemic has hit everybody, and it's never quite clear as to what the right thing to do is. But I think what happened is some of the other countries were being more proactive and pushing for them not to get onto the amber list, or if they were on the red list, not even to get on the red list. They were providing much more information directly. They were lobbying ministers. We in the end had to, ask the Foreign Secretary of Pakistan to speak to the Foreign Secretary of Britain. We asked the Prime Minister of Pakistan to speak to the Prime Minister here. So there was the scientific, diplomatic and political pressures brought to bear. And I would just say, so next time you are stuck with any problem of this sort, try to just, think of other people that you can involve and get towards solving a solution.
Thank you so much for illuminating for us sort of the ways in which some of this advocacy takes place. I think that fact is often lost, but the APPG seems to be a very good case study of how not only cross-party but cross-national and cross-disciplinary coalition building takes place. So earlier in your opening remarks, you mentioned that, over time, given sort of the 75 years of diplomatic ties Pakistan and the UK have had, there's been a general, sentiment of goodwill in terms of contributing to the development of the country, in terms of making sure that amicable ties are maintained. Let's complicate that picture a little bit, right? So last summer, as you very well know, the UK government decided to cut down on its aid budget. So from 0.7% of the GNI, we went to 0.5%. And as you noted in your letter to the Minister of State for South Asian Commonwealth, this would mean that Pakistan's aid budget is basically decreasing around 75 or so percent over 6 years. So given this sort of tricky picture and given your experience as Shadow Minister for International Development, can you, one, give us some more context to this development? And then two, what kind of impact do you think it will have on development agendas on the ground? particularly in areas such as girls' education, which has been a core element of these bilateral ties as far as social development is concerned. How do you think this shifting aid landscape may shape Pakistan-UK relations for the foreseeable future?
Okay, so I don't know if we were following the politics in the UK, but there was a time when we had the Foreign Office, a department in its own right, and there was a Department for International Development, which had its own cabinet minister, was a department in its own right. The Conservative government decided that it was going to abolish the Department for International Development and make it part of the Foreign Office, which really meant that this department was going to get less weighting than the Foreign Office. It was going to be part and parcel of the Foreign Office. They wanted to cut its budget, and the government essentially used the pandemic as an excuse to cut aid from 0.7 to 0.5. They argued that, because the country at the moment is in economic issues, because it's had to spend so much money on the pandemic, that they should have to find money from other sources, and they used the aid budget. Now, as far as I'm concerned, and we said it, this was pure cynical manipulation. The Conservative Party knows that it gets votes now in the last number of years from people who belong to EDL, UKIP, these kind of right-wing individuals who have never liked United Kingdom giving any money to overseas development. And they know that by doing this, they will ensure that those voters continue to vote for them, which is one of the reasons why people think, with everything that's happening, why do Conservatives still have such a majority? And the truth is that this particular Conservative government, for the last number of years, is in some respect very, very right-wing government. And they knew this is what we call red meat to talk to their voters who hate giving aid. So we've always said that actually to use the excuse of the pandemic to cut aid was always a smokescreen to essentially hold on to a certain category of voters to vote for it. But of course, it did have an impact in the sense that the Department for International Development then had to cut aid budgets of many countries, and of course Pakistan is one of the largest recipients, inevitably got a dip and a cut in its budget as well. And also the government decided that they were, instead of using aid budget, which beforehand was purely for humanitarian purposes, the government's international policy changed, and they said that they were going to link aid with security as well as commercial opportunities. So if a country where they want to do business or commerce, or they're going to sell them arms or whatever, that they want to perhaps spend more money on those countries than others. So our foreign policy and our development policy merged instead of remaining separate, which they were until some years ago. And that's the context in which Pakistan. So obviously it has had an impact. There has been, the Department for International Development has just done an inquiry into Pakistan, the Select Committee. And I think its findings are going to be coming. But I think, my understanding is that they're going to recommend that the Pakistan budget should be restored, or at least it should be brought back to the figures it was. So that there's not, they shouldn't have the cuts. That it should be, some of it should be redressed back. But we wait to see what the report says. And obviously when the report comes out, we'll have some say on that. I mean, the other issue, of course, I've been dealing with is in relation to the PIA's license being cancelled to be able to travel in certain parts of the world. So I've been talking to Air Vice Marshal Askar Arshad, who's in charge of PIA at the moment, and the Civil Aviation Authority, and our ministers here as well, to try to ensure that that matter is resolved. I am told that next month there's going to be final sort of testing or analysis done, and then hopefully maybe in a month or two time PI may be able to resume its flights. But don't quote me on it, that's my understanding what the position is currently.
Right. So the immediate fallout is yet to be determined in terms of what the impact, can look like. And quite right in terms of sort of the impact of combining, quote unquote, aid with other strategic interests. We're sort of already seeing that in the context of Afghanistan, where the first £30 million or so of the budget that the UK dedicated, some of it has been transferred to Pakistan in terms of managing security threats, or also rehabilitation and humanitarian needs in that context. So sort of along those notes, globally we've observed a certain sort of bipolarity in terms of the division of powers. You've got the Sino-Russian bloc on one hand, then you've got what's quote unquote called the West, which primarily means the US, the UK, and the PDI government has been, treading that line carefully. They have not chosen any sides explicitly, and Imran Khan has certainly expressed that, they want to maintain friendly relations with all countries, making sure that the diplomatic ties are in the best benefit and interest of the Pakistani people. So I'm curious to know, sort of from your, perspective here in the UK, how is that perceived? Do you see any challenges to this kind of, towing the line between the two? How do you think that this kind of stance from the Pakistani government will impact Pakistan-UK bilateral relations in the future, especially in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine, of course, and of course the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I think Pakistan's going to have quite a tight road to travel on. I've always felt, and as I said, I'm not an expert on this, but I've always felt that right from the beginning, perhaps Pakistan aligned themselves too much on one side as opposed to the other. But I think generally, I actually find it very discomforting that the whole world has kind of polarized itself, the East and the West, or there's Russia and others, and West and USA. I actually think that's really sad, because I actually think, and maybe I'm being idealistic, I don't think there should be a divide. I think that all countries should be working with each other. I think all countries should be trading with each other, or should be having diplomatic relationship with each other, and all countries should be defending each other. And I think that, the UN and its very noble aims of humanitarian assistance, of equality, of human rights, of protection, I think all countries should be abiding by that, and I think they should all be working together. And I would love to see more of that. And I'm sad that what's happening now with Russia and Ukraine, because it seems that if there was going to be any meeting of minds, or if there's going to be any kind of mixing, it's kind of pushed everything back by many, many years globally. As for Pakistan, obviously Pakistan, is, and I have to say this very carefully, I mean, Pakistan's history from the time it was formed, and then with the death of some of the best leaders I think Pakistan had in the early days passing away, there was instability, and then you did have sort of, the strong men like General Ayub and others bringing his plans in, and then you had democracy, and then you had Zia, then you've had different people coming in. And as a result of it, Pakistan's position, I think, got weakened. And so when, for example, Pakistan got involved in the Afghanistan war, I think Pakistan should have ideally kept itself out of it. I don't think they should have gone on anyone's particular side. And I think Pakistan should have been maintaining that sort of policy. But of course, it's very easy to sit here and say that when you are a country surrounded by and expectations from you from powerful countries, you sometimes do have to lean one way or the other. And so obviously, inevitably, Pakistan ended up leaning towards the Americas as opposed to the other side. And now, of course, they're trying to recorrect that balance. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And I think done in a proper way, I don't think it would cause too much problem. But I do think that recently what happened with the Prime Minister's very visible visit to Russia and the deal and the comments, I don't think that have helped. Pakistan at the moment, certainly in the British diplomatic world. I don't want to say too much in that, but I think that some people have found that very uncomfortable, and they're not. Even some members of parliament have found that not very happy, because at the moment the whole world is trying to impose sanctions on Russia, and they're, something completely different is happening. So I think, it's regrettable. Obviously, I know this visit was pre-planned ages ago, but I think sometimes you have to deal with these things in a more diplomatic way, and I think things are done a bit differently. And I do think that some of these actions on the Western side of it will not have, it's not caused, it hasn't helped, put it this way, Pakistan's situation. But I'm hoping that this is very much a temporary situation, and that in due course, Pakistan did say that Russia should not invade Ukraine, so they have said that very clearly. But I think it needs to, I think in due course, I think it should, and I think everybody in the world, to be honest, realigning. I'm realigning the case, for example, as you know, India at one time was very close to Russia, but now India has gravitated more towards the USA, not so much Russia, but there's still that relationship. And of course, China's gravitated, Pakistan and China have always gravitated towards each other. I do see, though, a different power blocks being built, and actually what's happening the last week, I think it's going to reshape international relations for everybody in the world. I think many countries in the world are going to have to determine, what they're going to do, who they're going to have a relationship with. But I always think that, if as a country you can have good relationship with everybody, that's probably the best thing to do.
I really like how this sobering conversation sort of ended on that positive note. I like the direction that this conversation is taking, but I don't want to get too excited with my own questions. Perhaps it's a good time to open it up to the floor and see if folks in the room have anything they want to ask. Please go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation. Just a question about following on from relationship between countries and naturally concerning Pakistan itself. What would your view be, and Britain's view, with regard to the rise of far-right extremist Hindutva ideology in India? Of course, we've seen in recent times occupied Kashmir effectively being turned into an open prison under siege. And of course, the ideology espouses expansionism. So they have a view on all of Kashmir, on the Azad Kashmir itself. And that view doesn't remain there. It extends into Pakistan itself. So the long-term view of this philosophy is to ultimately absorb Pakistan into a greater India. So what would Britain's position be on this extremist view? Thank you.
We'll take one time or two at a time.
Maybe we can do two, or I think there was a hand over there. Or did I not? Did anyone here have a question?
A bit hard to hear.
Okay, maybe.
Can they hear me?
I think so. Or do you want the mic?
Thank you for your presentation. Sorry, my question is on a slightly different track, so is it too close? So you talked about the way forward. We know that Britain's colonial history, East India Company, Pakistan, an ex-colony. What do you see the role of debt and loans to so-called third world countries, and
Debt
how?
and loan, right?
Sorry?
You said debt and loan.
Yeah.
I'm slightly hard of hearing.
Sure. No, please. Yeah. If my question is.
The microphone's working fully.
I can hear you fine. So we have countries which were previous colonies, which some of them, the majority of them, still are classed in the third world. So about the way forward between UK and Pakistan, where do you see the role of debt and loans to so-called poorer countries, and how, if we want to really elevate Pakistan's position, how should we view debt and loans? And, or is this actually a mechanism of neo-colonialism to keep these countries down?
So, firstly, you raised 2 points. There's the Hinduism ideology, and then there's the issue about Kashmir. And I would say them as 2 separate points because we know the rise of this policy, the ideology that India for Hindus only, and Hinduism policy is essentially that. And at the moment, not only Muslims are being persecuted, but Christians are being persecuted, Sikhs are being persecuted, and actually, I don't think I put it in a public sphere, but actually, literally 3 days ago, I wrote a letter to our Foreign Secretary exactly detailing about the rise of this. It's a 3-page letter setting out stuff that's happening in India about minority communities. I wait to see what happens. It's an issue that we have raised in Parliament quite a few times about the Hinduism policy. At the moment, sadly, the government that we have in power does not seem to want to acknowledge any of this. Now, maybe behind the scenes, they're talking to India, maybe behind the scenes, they're doing things. I don't know. But publicly, this government, no one will criticize India at all. And I think the main reason is because they want to do these billions and billions of dollars deal with India, and the economic situation has become the more paramount for the United Kingdom. And as I said, they may be doing backroom diplomacy. I don't know about that. Nobody tells about it. But when we have raised this issue publicly, and I've raised it at Prime Minister's question, and not only me, others have raised this, and the ministers, prime ministers and others have just ignored it, not answered the question. On the issue of Kashmir, we know things have been happening in Jammu Kashmir, what with all those articles about changing the demographics of Kashmir so that if there was ever a referendum, you know, they might have a Hindu majority so that it will stay with India. We know all of those laws have been passed. Again, we have raised them. And again, this government it's all falling on deaf ears completely. I don't know what's happening in the background, but publicly they won't say anything. And when they do talk about Kashmir, they always say, oh, this is, because the Shimla Agreement, this is between Pakistan and India. And that we essentially, have nothing to do with this. We have raised, my colleagues, we have said, well, this is a result of historical settlements done in the 40s, and Britain should be taking responsibility for it, and the international community should be getting involved in it. But I'm afraid to say that so far, there's a complete, deafening silence on part of our government to acknowledge that anything wrong is happening. So it's a continuous work that people need to do. But I think what it needs to do is not just the MPs, I think individuals need to write to their government. So those are, I don't know how many people are from UK or from, abroad, but whichever area you live in, contact your local member of parliament, especially if it's a Conservative member of parliament, and write to them and explain to them what your concerns are, what's happening in these parts of the world, and ask your member of parliament to raise this in the House. Because what we have at the moment is there's people like myself and a few others who will raise these issues. But you need 650 MPs. You need to be engaging with all these others, not all necessarily 650, but you need to engage with the others. You need to write to them and you need to ask, you want to go and meet them. As a constituency MP, I see my constituents regularly. They make appointments, they come and see me, I have a chat with them, they tell me whatever they want to talk about, national, international, domestic issues, I talk to them, and all MPs do that. So what you should be doing actually, because only by, you've got a heave of people raising this issue, if loads of members of parliament are being pressurised, then maybe they'll start talking about it, and then you might get the government changing its position. On the issue of debts and loans, I think is what you were talking about, if I understood, and the economics issues. Well, I've been one of those people years ago. I think that all international countries, the rich countries, the debt should be cancelled for all countries in the world. That's my view. That's people like Third World, sort of charity that deal with these sort of issues have been saying that we should, because then allow these countries to start afresh and they can start running their countries without the debts behind them. And I've said that this has two benefits. A, it's morally the right thing to do, because we pay them, we give them a loan, then we take so much back from them that most of the time they're just struggling to pay off the interest on the debts. And secondly, that if you take the debt away from these countries, you will leave the countries with money that they can use, and then they can buy your products, your services, and it can help international trade as well. So it's an economic sense as well as a moral sense. But sadly, unfortunately, again, these kind of things at the moment are falling on deaf ears. Not only, most countries in the world don't want to do this, and the international organizations which are involved in this lending don't seem to want to. Again, in my opinion, it's short-sightedness on their part, but it's an issue, again, that some of us, certainly on my side as a political party, it's something that we raise quite a lot, and maybe if we were in power, perhaps it's something that we can work. I mean, I will certainly continue to lobby, if we got in government, our ministers and my Prime Minister to do that.
Thanks for your speech. Just coming back on Kashmir, now if there is a Labour Party in the next general election that wins, do you think anything's going to radically change, or will it be again economic interests triumphing against humanitarian? Thanks, it's just that.
I've noticed one thing I've observed over the years, that when it comes to international relations, the political parties of this country tend to be very similar. The policies are very similar, aligned. And it's always aligned more with America, it's more aligned with the economic interests, and very few are willing to put their head above the parapet. So I know that in the past, two Labour Foreign Secretaries, Robin Cook and David Miliband, I know when they were Foreign Secretaries, they raised the issue of Kashmir with the Indian counterparts or whatever, and basically India's response was nothing to do with you. And I think because of the economic ties, because everybody in the world wants to trade with India, it's a population with 1.3 billion now, and it's got a middle-class market of more than 500 million. I mean, that's a massive trade market, and nobody wants to upset that, sadly. And it's wrong, but so on that front, you're right, I can't see much change. But I suppose on domestic issues, my party is far better than the Conservatives. So, and I suppose for a lot of them, what they're concerned about is the bread and butter issues of their people. And so in England, we want people in this country to have good jobs, we want them to have economic prosperity. And so we're not going to do something that's going to jeopardize other countries' prosperity. And at the end of the day, the nation state always wants to do what is right for their, and then afterwards it's anybody else.
Thank you for your speech, and Jazakallah khair. I just had a question. It's admirable how you still have close relations with the reality in Pakistan and how optimistic you are with the future for Pakistan. And you touched upon some problems within Pakistan, whether that be social, economic, political. But what it looks like is that it is, and history has shown this, how an acceptance of, it feels like as if it's a systematic problem, yeah? And, you know, history has shown that Pakistan used to be part of a greater India, which used to control 25% of the world's GDP. Now Pakistan controls like, I think it's a fraction of a percent or 0.3 or something like that. Do you think the problem within Pakistan is accepting a Western system which has, to be frankly honest, reality has shown that it has affected us more than anything?
Yeah. Can I just clarification of that question, because I was a little bit unsure. I think you're trying to say that the Western system hasn't worked in Pakistan.
Yes, that is, yes.
The Western economic or legal or all of it.
Yeah, political, economic. I feel like it's just because I've spent most of my life in Pakistan and I've just seen a decline, like even problems like from the previous questions, whether that be from what it looks like a never-ending debt or the Kashmir issue or problems like these.
I got that.
We've got a second question here.
Thank you. Actually, just a quick follow-up. Would you then say from your comment or your fairly detailed explanation that economic interests trump moral values? You know, for example, in relation to India, the political system here will always favor and look towards the billions of trade deals which lie on the table with India. So, and that would always dominate versus any other kind of moral or ethical consideration on the table. So given this scenario, is it not sensible and safe and rational to conclude that the very inherent nature of such a political system doesn't work?
Okay. Any more? Okay, we'll just hit two questions. I actually think the problems of Pakistan are not to do with the fact that they're trying to emulate a Western sort of economics or Western whatever. I'll be honest with you, the problem with Pakistan is that over the years, you've had bad leadership. You had bad management of Pakistan. Now, you know more details, but I know from what I read, Pakistan's got enormous amount of resources, minerals, energy, everything. Really highly educated, skilled people in Pakistan. But a lot of them have left Pakistan, the brain drain, and it continues. Why? Why is that? It's not because of the West, I'm sorry to say. This is sometimes we have to take responsibility for our own actions. And I think over the years, so people, why did it? Oh, because of bribery, because of corruption, because of sparage, because of this, because of that. You know, we're not safe, we're not this, which is why. But why is that the case? That's not anybody else's fault. That's our own fault. Why? Because when we've had some loans from outside world to do things, everybody knows that it's gone into pockets of loads of people and hasn't been spent on Pakistan. You've had successive leaders, I'm sorry to say, who have failed Pakistan miserably. And sadly, the people of Pakistan have been failed. So I think to use, and I don't know, you know, whether somebody always say, you know that expression, apne girban ko dekho. And I think that's what Pakistan needs to do. It's got resources, it's got everything. There's no reason Pakistan needs to rely on any country for anything. It can produce everything. It's got such a fertile land. And even the dry, barren lands can produce different types of produce. It's got everything it needs. It doesn't need anything from the outside world. It's just that it hasn't been developed properly. It hasn't been used properly. The resources of Pakistan and its people haven't been used properly. And I think if you have a different, over the years, you know, if you get different management, if you get people who genuinely want to put Pakistan at the heart, you find Pakistan will change. And so therefore, I don't think the Western way of life is the reason. Problems are lying much more deep in those who've been leading and people around the leaders. And as for the Kashmir issue, the economic ties, yeah, I'm sorry to say, and it's really sad, and I hate to say this, but yeah, a lot of countries, the economy is number one. I mean, let me give you an example. So you've got the Uyghur genocide happening in China. Yes, Burma has been killing Rohingyas, which are Muslims, but Muslim countries have been trading with them, have been selling them armaments. Very few of them said anything about genocide. Sorry?
Including Pakistan.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Precisely. I wasn't trying to, I didn't want to pick on a particular country, but yes, Pakistan sold armament to Burma. In fact, I just written a letter to Imran Khan saying that that's not a good idea. I don't think you should be doing that. We've got the genocide issue. We've got, so many things happening. And not just like, well, I'm talking about, Muslim countries who are supposed to be, we're supposed to be this great ummah, yes? But there are so many Muslim countries where so much bad things are happening, and other rich Muslim countries are doing very little about it. Why aren't they coming out and doing things? Why aren't they condemning? The Rohingya thing when it was happening, or even the Burma genocide, I set up the all-parties parliamentary group on the Rohingyas 6 years ago. And we've been doing a lot of work in our British Parliament about it and about what's happening to them. You know what, sometimes I get told, said, why isn't a single Muslim country speaking up for that? Why are the Western countries, we know why they're doing it, but why are the Muslim countries not speaking up for it? Why? Because everybody is interested in trade there as well, and it's a geopolitics. Sadly, money talks everywhere. I'm sorry, I don't want to be negative, but that's why it's important that every country becomes its own sustain itself financially and every other way. And so, I ask that of the Muslim world itself. Why are they behind in so many ways? And I think, if they got together and they use their economic muscle, they could actually change virtually everything if they wanted to. But they choose not to.
So I'm afraid we're sort of coming toward a close.
Sorry,
as part of
getting very heavy, serious.
I think we can take maybe one or two more questions. There was a hand here earlier.
Could I follow up on mine as well?
Oh, okay, that's coming up to a lot of questions. All right, so there was a hand here, and then you can go ahead, and then we can come to you, sir, if that's okay.
Can I ask my question?
Yes.
Yeah. So touching back on your point, about Pakistan having bad leaders rather than having a bad system, which is, I think, one of the members of the audience brought up. Touching back on that point, I study physics at King's, and I believe in statistics and probability. Looking at how repeatedly we've had bad leaders, not only in Pakistan, as you've said, in the Muslim world, where they've compromised over Islamic issues and they've preferred economic ties. And I have the belief that no one is perfect, no leader will be perfect. Don't you think that rather than there being a consistency in bad leaders, where people even expected that Imran Khan would be a new change, that he'd bring a Naya Pakistan, so on and so forth. We thought that Imran Khan would be a genuine leader, but he didn't turn out to be like that. So don't you think that rather than focusing on, we need to wait for a good leader and so on and so forth, there's actually something wrong with the system, that the system allows these leaders to do what they can do, and that there should be a change in system where we should have a system maybe, that doesn't allow which regulates these leaders from doing what they're doing. And a good example is the leaders that we had in the past, even in our own Islamic history, such as Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, who reduced his own salary so that he could feed the people who used to carry bags of food on his own shoulders when he controlled from North Africa all the way to the Middle East. He used to go out and feed the people by himself because his priority was to meet the basic needs of the people. So don't you think that it's a problem with the system, not just, there's a consistent probability of bad leaders coming into power?
If I understand what you're trying, as I said, because of my hard hearing, I wasn't able to follow everything you said.
Yeah.
You're trying to say that it's more the system that's caused the problem
Yeah.
than the people caused it, right?
Yeah, the system has allowed these people to do.
Were you talking about the Prophet ﷺ, about him carrying, or who were you saying?
No, Abu Bakr radiallahu anh. Abu Bakr radiallahu anh.
Oh, okay, right. So you're going back to the times of the Khalifas, right?
Even Sultan Abdul Hamid II, for example. Sultan Abdul Hamid II.
Sultan Abdul Hamid.
Yeah, but you're talking about people
In the past.
centuries ago.
Even 100 years ago.
Yeah, 100 years ago. So let me put you this way. Let me tell you this. I agree. In the Prophet's time and the Khalifas and everything, they looked after Ummas and everybody. They had the battle mar where everybody was dealt very fairly and they looked after them economically. But this country, right, or USA and all these countries, right, they've got the system that you think brings corrupt people in there. But how come that same system is able to bring good here? It's not the system.
But did you not see the TFL strikes happening yesterday?
I mean, if you had a choice, I mean, a lot of people, I had, here in this country, there are, in England, right, we have some challenges. But generally, it's a country where there is good economic distribution, there is a good justice system, there is a system of fairness, and most people will get their right, and there is a rule of law. And, things are very different here, or in the USA, whatever we might say about USA's foreign policy, but what happens internally within this country, or the Western models, they are more liberal, they are more freer, and they are less corrupt, and they have people who are financially more stable, and the poor are not as poor, and people have better rights. So nothing wrong with the system. It is, I'm sorry, the way it's implemented or the people. Because the same is human beings here as well doing the same. How come they're able to reach this level, and in some parts of the world we can't? And on the system of, the Khilafat, that's brilliant. But you tell me, which country in this world, Islamic country, is following? They say they're Muslim countries, but how many of them? They don't even have. Some of them don't have voting system or democracy, which you might think is a reason for corrupt people coming in. A lot of them are tyranny, they're dictatorships, but they're not doing anything better either, are they? Which of these wonderful Muslim countries are doing a phenomenal job of giving rights to their people, to ordinary people? So I think, right, blaming a system or saying a system, no, it's people. Sadly say. Now, Pakistan, of course, is a victim of its own history. Yes? After 1947, with all the troubles, with those brilliant leaders like Rajas and Liaquat Saab, those people passing away a lot earlier than they should have. I think, in my opinion, I'm not an expert about Pakistan, I think if they had survived for longer and had been there and got good systems in Pakistan entrenched, which they believed in, and there had been that stability provided to Pakistan at the beginning, I think Pakistan would be at a very different level at this moment in time. But they died too soon, and instability came in, and then a lot of people came who sort of, I remember, even though I was saying about Ayub Khan, the martial law administrator, but one thing, as I understand it, the rupees was, I think, it was 20 rupees to a pound. The Pakistan International Airline was one of the world-beating airline. What's her name? Mrs. Kennedy traveled on it. They were so different. And then you had some of the religious people get in. Then you had Afghanistan war, and that destroyed Pakistan. So there's a lot of things that have been the cause of it, and our involvement in Afghanistan has been the worst thing for Pakistan ever. It led to destruction, it's led to change in ideology. So, but what I'm saying is that the reason we got involved in these wars, that is a failure of a leadership. Yes, there are extenuating circumstances, and I get the problems Pakistan's had since its inception. And then we had the war in East Pakistan, West Pakistan. That was created by politicians, not by a religious system, but that was because one prime minister didn't want to relinquish power to the other side who'd fairly and squarely won, which led to the split of Pakistan. That's bad management, bad leadership. And that's what there's been a failure of, I think. I mean, I don't know, you know, I might be reading history wrongly, and I'm sure you will correct me at the end, but that's, to me, it's leadership failure.
Thank you very much.
I know there are a lot of burning questions, but you, sir, had your hand up. Would you still like to go ahead?
No, I think it's okay.
You're good? Okay. Then I'm afraid we don't have one more to ask. Okay, someone who hasn't had a chance before. You can go ahead.
Firstly, assalamu alaikum, and thank you for everything you've said so far. My question is you mentioned earlier that kind of the Muslim countries around the world, why aren't they standing up and why aren't they saying anything to the oppression that's happening across the world, be it with the Kashmiris, the people of Yemen, the people of Rohingya? My question is that don't you think it's kind of the right of Pakistan as one of the world's most powerful militaries, the only Muslim country that has nuclear armed weapons? Isn't it kind of the duty of Pakistan itself to be that first country to make that first step and support these Muslim nations? Because how can you expect kind of the weaker nations, Muslim nations among us, to kind of have that courage to step forward if Pakistan doesn't do it itself?
I got the bit about Pakistan being the only nuclear nation, Muslim nation, and the weaker country. What is it you thought Pakistan should do?
Isn't it the duty of Pakistan to therefore be the first Muslim country to step out and kind of and kind of encourage like stopping this Muslim oppression that's happening around the world? Because if they don't have the courage to do it, how can you expect any other of these Muslim countries to do it?
I think Pakistan may have, yes, it's got a nuclear weapon, but again, it alone can't do things. It doesn't have that sort of resources to be able to do things on its own. I'm sure if it could, I'm sure it would have done so. You know, it has to look at its economic situation, it has to look at its political situation, it has to look at its own vulnerabilities. Pakistan alone, you can't expect it to resolve these issues. But I think if the Muslim world got together, all of them, then they may be able to, you know, stop the persecution of the Uyghurs. They may be able to stop the issue of the Rohingyas and other, you know, conflicts that are happening. And actually not just in relation to Muslims. I think wherever there's bad things happening, whether it's in parts of Africa, there's, you know, or even South America, I think Muslim nations should get together and help those people. I think as a Muslim, as a human being, we should all be helping everyone. I don't think it should be just territorial. I think if you see non-Muslims start in a bad way, you should help them just as much as you would help a Muslim. Humanity is the most common thing, the most important thing.
And on that note, I think we'll just bring it to a close. Before handing it over to Mustafa, thank you, Yasmin, so much for raising some of these existential questions and realities that we're always grappling with. I think you gave us a lot of food for thought and certainly, gave us a lot to think about. But yeah, Mustafa, over to you.
I would just like to thank everyone for attending our first session, and we're very grateful to you, Mrs. Qureshi, for joining us at the LSE Future of Pakistan Conference 2022. We're glad to have a friend of Pakistan in the British House of Commons, and we really appreciate all your efforts to foster UK-Pakistan relations. I would now like to request everyone to please join us outside for some refreshments. Our next speaker has arrived, and we will be starting the next session at 6 p.m. sharp. Thank you.